Steve Kullback is a vice president at the Nebo company. He supports growth by building relationships with clients, expanding our network of expert coaches and facilitators, and managing client engagements. He appreciates the transformative impact that good coaching and facilitation can have on leaders. As a leadership coach and facilitator, he enjoys helping leaders in transition when they are taking on new challenges and have to reimagine their role, contribution, and legacy. Without further ado, Steve.
Thanks, Raven, and thank you for the introduction. It sounds like we had an exciting start already to the webinar with a little bit of excitement in the background. As Raven said, my name's Steve Kullback, and I'm a vice president at the Nebo company. I think more importantly for today, I'm also a leadership coach and a leadership facilitator. And what we want to really focus on, and that's kind of a part of today, is to think about lessons learned, right? A lot has changed in this world over the last couple of months, and we've learned a lot of lessons about leadership. And so I'm really grateful to be in the position that I am as a leadership coach. Right now, it gives me the opportunity to talk to lots of leaders. Why I got into this business is to help leaders address their most important priorities. And so I feel grateful to be able to be of service right now. And today, what I want to do really is focus on this offer, which is to explore some really important questions that leaders are facing. There's a lot of questions on people's minds that we've discussed, to share some perspectives. So we've learned a lot of lessons, and we've shared perspective and some approaches that have really worked and continue to work and that are relevant today. And so what I want to do is address three really important questions that I've heard. There are really themes that have come up, although there are many questions being answered, and share some resources with you. So that's really our focus of today. So I'm going to turn off my camera right now, and then let you focus on the slides. And when we get to the Q&A, I'll turn the camera back on, and we can talk about some things that have come up. So just as a kind of level set, it's really no surprise, and I don't think we need to, anybody needs to be reminded that we're kind of being bombarded by the idea that we're in this new reality, an unprecedented time. And the facts play that out, right? So there's no underplaying it at all. We're facing new leadership challenges. And I think we're also a little bit overloaded with the messaging at this point. And what that leads us to is really a sense of this analogy of leading through a fog. And like a fog, often the senses that we rely on normally to make decisions get distorted. And like this little post here in this picture of a boat on a foggy lake, things pop up that we have to shift and change to address. So some of the questions that I've heard, there's a number of questions that leaders have been asking, and so I picked three that have come up over and over. And what I want to do is to talk about those questions and provide a few resources that may help you as you think through them. And the questions that we're going to focus on today, the first one is, how do I reconcile the intractable dilemmas that we're facing? So these are those challenges that stymie us and create challenges for moving forward. How do I make reliable decisions and act when information keeps changing? So information is shifting at a rapid pace. So how do we handle that? Number three is, how do we create and sustain momentum when our plans and strategies are overtaken or overturned? So most people in organizations have had to rethink their plans and strategies to address the current situation. So those are the questions that we're going to jump into. But before we do, I would love to hear what's on your mind. So if you would go into the chat function, and then I'll have Raven read a few. I'd just love to hear, what are some of the important questions that are on your mind right now, or that your leaders are facing? I've heard lots around people management, self-management. We talked about decision-making and strategies. So I'm going to just be quiet for about 15 seconds or so, maybe a little bit more, and invite you to join in right now.
Yes, so you can just go right ahead and type in the chat box some questions that you and your leaders are facing. we have one is, how do leaders balance safety versus the economics?
Yeah.
How do I lead when we are teleworking and never have done this before? How to make this safe for employees? Keeping trust with our workforce as these shifts hit us. Great question. How can we reimagine our strategies within our policies to speed up processes? What and when does return to office look like? That's a great one. Now that
Requires a crystal ball.
now that we've proven productivity online, how do we transition back, and what do we hope to get out of that?
Yeah.
Just a couple more of, how do we share hard news with our team without completely de-energizing them? How do we keep focused on the priorities versus emerging changes to the environment?
Yeah. So these are all great questions, and keep them coming, because we'll be able to collect those. And if we don't get a chance to address them today, we'll try to address them in either future sessions, or feel free to reach out to us. So I think that what I would ask you to do as we move forward is keep your questions in mind. We're going to talk about 3 approaches, and the 3 questions that I brought up at the beginning. But maybe you'll find some things in these ideas that might be able to help you with yours. So one of the things I want to highlight before we jump in is leaders are called to action. So if you think about the questions that I raised at the beginning, they all start with how, right? And so how questions are questions of actions, and a basic expectation we have of leaders is to act, or to mobilize and enroll action in others. But we want to be clear that action and new actions is really not enough to create sustainable change. So if you look on this model, this is the model of transformational leadership. And all I want to highlight here is that new actions and sustainable actions and change are based in an ability to see new things, which is new perspectives and meaning making, how you make meaning of new situations. Saying, which is really conversation, is the currency of leadership. So we use language to guide, to direct, to engage. So we also need new ways of communicating in order to bring people along. And then the last is being, and that's all about leadership presence. It's about how you experience change, and also how people experience you within the process of change. So the questions are often based in action, but we need to keep these other ideas in mind as we move forward. And you'll see those show up in the approaches that we're talking about. So the first question I asked is, how do I reconcile intractable dilemmas we are facing? And what I mean by an intractable dilemma is a challenge that stymies us, right? So if you look at this picture of this truck that's stuck in the mud, often when we have dilemmas or facing paradox within the context of change, it creates a chance that we're going to get stuck and have a trouble moving forward. And so one of the things that I wanted to share today is this idea of leveraging polarities as a path to creative action. And just quickly, in the context of the conversation we're having today, you can kind of interchange the word dilemma, the word paradox, or the word polarity. But we're going to be addressing polarities. So the one place to start would be really to defining what the issue is. And the first is to understand, are you dealing with a problem, or are you dealing with a polarity? So this first example that's at the top is really a complex problem. So it's a problem is a question or a puzzle that we have to solve. It can be very complex, incredibly difficult, requiring a huge amount of skill and experience to address, but they're generally solvable. And they have independent, mutually exclusive solutions, meaning the solutions can stand alone. So in this example, you have a classic strategic challenge, which is, do you invest in a market or not? Do you exit a market that you're in or stay in it? Those are very difficult. Very difficult questions to answer, but they're basic problems that you can solve with analysis. What you see here is a polarity that's facing a lot of leaders right now. It's one that's come up in many of the conversations I've had. And this is this dilemma, and I think it came up as a question earlier in the questions was, how do you make choices between economic viability and employee welfare? What does that mean? I want to read this definition of polarities. This comes from Navigating Polarities that was written by some colleagues of ours, Brian Emerson and Kelly Lewis. And the definition is, is a polarity is a situation in which two interdependent and seemingly contradictory states must coexist over time to ensure success. And so if you look at this example, you can't have one without the other. And so this is not a solvable issue. They're interdependent alternatives. They can't stand alone. So if you don't have economic viability of an organization, you can't ensure employee welfare. You won't have employees. If you don't have employee welfare and you don't have healthy people or resilient people working for you, you're not going to be able to sustain economic viability. And I think one of the challenges that plays in here is kind of a classic leadership mind trap, is when people start to treat polarities as if they were problems. And that raises a lot of challenges. And one, I mean, you can think of the common use of polarization in today's discourse. But in organizations and for leaders, this shows up. It may not be quite as visible as what you see on the daily news, but polarities are really all around us, particularly when we're dealing with complexity. So how do you manage polarities? So I talked about leveraging polarities to create creative paths. And so there's two things here that I want to talk about on this slide. One is recognizing polarities in real time, which is sounds easier than it actually is. And the other is the title of the slide, which is to move from oppositional to integrative, which is really thinking about these as opposed to being two separate poles or decisions to being an integrated whole. And that's really where the and in the middle comes in. So the first, recognizing polarities in real time. Polarities are really deceptively simple. In a way, conceptually, they're quite easy. But what I find in a lot of my coaching is leaders can get stuck in polarities and not even see them. So one of the important things is to be able to recognize when you're in a polarity and step back from it so that you can get perspective and be creative about solutions. So just as an example, this polarity here, support and challenge, this came from a coaching session that I've had recently with a client where she was really thinking about creating a supportive environment and how that works for her employees, but also the need to move forward, right? And the need to create accountability, the need to focus on results. And so she was thinking about this challenge of how to do both at the same time. And her, one of the things I'll talk a little bit about is people naturally have a preference for one pole or the other. That's a natural thing. Her natural preference was around challenge, right? So she was having a struggle really playing and being in that support mode when results were calling for her. So it's really important to notice not only the polarity that you're in, but also where your preferences are, because each pole has benefits, each pole has risks of overuse. And so until you can step back and see those things clearly, then you can make creative solutions for your organization and for your team. So I want to invite you into a poll here. So this is about recognizing polarities for yourself. And so what I'd ask you to do, and Raven, if you could put the poll up, I've picked 8 polarities. We've talked about a couple of them already. Support and challenge is one. Economic welfare or employee welfare and economic viability is another. So I'd invite you to go into the poll, just quickly take 30 seconds, and think about what polarities resonate for you right now. I just ask you to pick 2, and we'll see what are some of the ones that are a focus for you right now.
Alrighty, so we have the poll has been launched, and we have some votes coming in. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to complete the poll and select your 2 answers. About 10 more seconds to complete if you haven't done so. Truth and compassion, self-care and team care. These are very interesting polarities. All right, I'm going to end the poll now.
All right, let's hear it.
All righty, so some top answers is immediate and long-term, realistic and optimistic, self-care and team care, and support and challenge, and employee welfare and economic viability. Steve, do you have any insights on those answers?
Yeah, well, I think one insight that I would have, or one observation, is there are many polarities, and really kind of the more you look, the more you see. Immediate and long term is one that's come up a lot for me. We'll actually talk about this a little bit in the last section of the presentation when we talk about the use of vision. So how do you, when information is changing so quickly, how do you keep also focus on the long term? So that's a really important polarity people are finding. And realistic and optimistic is another one that we've hosted a number of conversations with leaders across industries and organizations. And that one is one that often comes up as a challenge. You want to keep people motivated. You want to keep people inspired and confident in the future. And leaders often don't have what's the right answer to give because they don't have enough information to see into the future. So balancing those things and keeping people motivated and with hope, but also speaking the truth really is very difficult. So thank you all for sharing. And I think you'll notice, I would invite you as you move forward and sort of think about your own context, where polarities are popping up for you. So the more you can recognize those in real time, the more likely you are to be able to step back, bring people in and come up with creative solutions. And that's really what this slide is about, is a creative path to action. So we talked a little bit about recognizing and surfacing. So this is really identifying the polarities and defining the poles. So defining the poles, it may seem a little detail oriented, but once you understand what the polarities are, you can identify what's at risk or what you have to gain. And so recognizing those and surfacing them really means bringing others in and communicating with them about them. Polarities, often when they're unrecognized and unspoken, create conflict, they create tension. As the picture in the intro indicated, they can create inertia as well. The next is explore and innovate. And this is really getting perspective on the polarity. So perspectives and values. The polarities that often have the deepest resonance with people are ones that touch their values. So if you can step back and talk to people and understand where core values are at play, and we'll talk about values a little more as well, that helps you come up with some creative solutions. Right? So the idea here with polarities is not just to split the difference, not to compromise down the middle, but to come up with creative solutions, because they're not, as I said earlier, they're not really problems that can be solved. And then the last is act and sustain. As I mentioned, like polarities have lots of energy to them, and they're also fairly powerful because they're not easily solvable. So the idea of acting, creating a plan to act, and then recognizing what's the dynamic situation. Are our actions still relevant, or do we need to adjust them? So that's really thinking about how to be adaptable and agile in the face of polarities. So I want to move on to the second question here, and that's how do I make reliable decisions and act when information keeps changing? So this is one that we face a lot, because I would say that what we normally expect in terms of change in the course of months is happening now in the course of weeks and days. And so our ability to get information that we can rely on over time is extremely difficult. But at the same time, basic human nature is that people seek certainty, and they also expect their leaders to be right. And to be honest, most of the leaders that I work with expect that of themselves as well. And so there's this idea of holding on to being right and rightness, but that's not really feasible right now. So it creates a huge dilemma. This is another paradox for people. It's around rightness when information keeps changing. And so what I want to highlight here is to bring values into your decision making. So values don't remove ambiguity, but what they do is when you can't be right about specific decisions, you can ensure and communicate that you're acting for the right reasons. And that can be a really important thing. So values don't really change, not frequently, but information changes rapidly over time. And so orienting with values is really important. And this is a good quote. This is from Roy Disney. He's Walt Disney's nephew. And what he says is, when your values are clear to you, making decisions becomes easier. And that really kind of hits the core of this, is when you're acting on decisions, particularly in difficult times and for difficult decisions, you can be convicted, even if you know that the decision might not be technically right over the long run. So a little bit about values and where they fit. So at the bottom, I'll start at the bottom with strategy. The strategy answers how questions, right? Really, it's how do you get there? What's the course of action? And how do we win, which is how do we succeed as an organization? So those kind of plans really rely on information that's not reliable right now. When you look at values, they answer what questions, and what questions are we call them meaning-making questions, which allow us to understand what's really important. So what matters most individually or as an organization, and what do we use that guides us? And when you can make decisions that are based on your values, you may not be able to decide how, but you can decide what's right for you. And values in action, this one is really important because, you know, aspiring to your values and acting on your values are actually two different things. And if values are going to be credible, actions and words have to align with the values. Because if people start to question where values fit in or if values are at play, that feeds into their recognition and perception of integrity, right? So trust, values, and integrity are all closely linked together. And values and actions are what guides decisions. They're what guides actions. They create expectations around behavior, and they also embed culture in organizations. And so it's really important not only that you know what your personal values are and also what your shared organizational values are, but that you act on them and communicate where you're acting on them so that people are clear and the perception of integrity remains intact. So this is an example, and actually I use this example from the Nebo company. We've talked to lots of clients who are using values very effectively in their organization, but I wanted to share something from our organization because we're allowed to publish our own information. So these are the 5 values that Nebo holds true: resilience, excellence, compassion, impact, and partnership. And this is actually a slide that we used in one of our team meetings. And what we did was we looked at each of our values, and this was probably 6 weeks ago or a little bit more now when we did this, is recognizing that times were changing and we were in a new environment. We brought our values out and for each one talked about where it was relevant today, specifically, meaning what actions were we going to take based on those values, what behaviors were we expecting from each other and with our clients, and how would they impact our decisions. And so we got very granular and very specific about our values, and we continue to bring those into our conversations. So I want to bring back to another chat to get a chance for you to bring some input in here. And I'd love to hear, what values are you using to guide your decisions right now? So I'll let Raven collect a few of the answers, and I'd love to see what values are driving your decisions.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, so you can just go and type them into the chat box and we'll just share a couple of them. Honesty, integrity, do what we say we're going to do. Great. Innovation, transparency, empathy, responsibility, relationships, compassion, authenticity. We have some great ones coming in. Courage, caring for people.
I love courage.
Yeah. Humanity, excellence, collaboration, loyalty, resilience, accountability, data-based decision-making, curiosity. Wow, some great values. Love, creativity, flexibility. It's great to see these values that are helping guide your decisions right now. And Steve, any thoughts on these?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that strikes me is the diversity of values there, right? All really positive attributes. And, you know, as an individual and as an organization, I think it's not as important what the values are, meaning our values versus the values that another organization holds, but that it defines who you are, and back to the definition, what matters most to you, and that you live in integrity with those things. Because I think when we come out, whatever the other side of this looks like, right, if we even have another side of it that is clearly distinguishable, you want to know that you acted in a way that that's in line with your values. And so for me, that's a hugely important idea. Let's, and this is really kind of a wrap of the how to orient with your values. So we talked a bit about what values are. I showed you this example, but some of the things that you can practically do with this. One, review and decide how values will guide your decisions. I kind of liken this to take your values off the wall. And if you go into a lot of offices or you look on websites, you'll often see values. But what you want to do, specifically at a time when there's so much uncertainty, is to take those off the wall and bring them into your interactions in a real and tangible way. And depending on where you sit in an organization or the structure of your organization, really making sure that you're not only discussing this at the senior leadership table, but encouraging and holding accountable leaders at all different levels to make sure they're empowering people to think about and make decisions about values that are relevant to them. One of the things that I see around culture is where uneven application of values happens across an organization, culture can break down, right? So really thinking about how do you make that a consistent, not only process, but also that your culture is consistent. Clarify and communicate where values fit into decisions. I think this is one of the biggest lessons I've heard over the last couple of months, which is to over communicate. In uncertainty, what seems clear to you in making a decision may not be clear at all to the people who are the consumers of those decisions, who are hearing those. And so really, particularly in difficult decisions, clarifying where values fit in is incredibly important. Recognize and surface polarities. So this is going back to the last section. When you think about values, values are not absolute. And they often run into competing priorities. And that's often is related to polarities. And so in the same way that you want to think creatively about polarities, when you find values confronting other important priorities, and I have an example of one that I've talked to a number of people about, and this is around employee welfare and economic viability. We talked about that in the polarity section. So I know of a number of leaders whose companies and whose personal values have people at the core of them, and they're making very difficult decisions now around how do they ensure the safety of their people and the welfare of the organization. How do they keep people employed during this time? And so often values will run up against things. And so, as I said earlier, values don't remove ambiguity, but they allow you to act with integrity. But you really need to understand the competing demands of those and communicate them with people. And then the last is just role model. You know, this isn't walking the talk, to use that cliche, is incredibly important, because values are only aspirations if they're not role modeled in action. So the last question, the third we want to talk about, and this was also a question that came up earlier in the question or the chats, was how do we create and sustain momentum while our strategies are overturned? So if you think about the world that existed 2 to 3 months ago, even now, about 2 months ago or so, depending on the industry and where you are, pretty much every person and every organization had to throw out their existing strategies and plans. So I can't even count the number of times I've heard the word pivot over the last couple of months, and that really implies how do we deal with a radical change to what we thought was going to happen during this year to what really is happening. And you know, planning is really about trusting the information that you have to make good decisions. No plans are 100% certain, but what's happened with the amount of change that's been going on is people's focus has narrowed to very short term. So if you just think about how popular the idea of 30-day rolling strategies are, really to plan out 30 days rather than to think about 18 months in the future. What does the next 30 days look like? And getting clarity on that might be all you can expect. This raises another polarity, though, which we talked about earlier, is short-term versus long-term. So 30 days and planning for the immediate future is important, but it's not sufficient on its own. And so really we're thinking about how do you bridge this and bring in some long-term perspective. And one of the things that we found and believe is that using vision can help create a bridge to the future. It helps create a bridge. So again, let's just go back to the definitions for a minute. Strategy, again, is a how question, but vision really answers the question, where are we going? And also, what does our preferred future look like? So anchoring in vision helps provide a destination for where you want to go. As the picture kind of intimated, that it's really can act as a North Star to help guide you. These are a couple of quotes that I love. These are both from Peter Senge. I think they're about 30 years old at this point, but they're as relevant today as they were then. The first is, the essence of leadership is reflecting on why we're here, where are we trying to go, and how is this guiding our day-to-day actions. And the where we're trying to go piece is really the vision. That's the vision that creates the picture and guides how we move forward. And then the day-to-day actions is really bringing that vision back into the present and using it as a way of making decisions about how we're acting in the immediate term. The second is about momentum. And this is really about not only how do you create action, but how do you keep energy, momentum, and engagement in your organization and with your people. And this other quote, the gap between vision and current reality is also a source of energy. So really, when you can picture the vision and also understand where you currently are, connecting to that vision allows you to create the momentum that you need to keep your people moving forward. So Nebo, one of our taglines really is making vision real. And so we've been doing visioning work for 16 years with clients. And And so we've learned a number of things. And one of the foundations of visioning is really to recognize that it rests on three important stories. And I say these because they're all really relevant right now. The past. And what's important about the past are not the activities that have happened or the events necessarily, but what makes us us is the question here. So the relevance for today is it really creates a foundation. If you understand who you are, you have a foundation and strength for the current times. The present is really understanding the current state, and that's where a lot of people are focusing right now. I love the question, what's true now? Because often when you ask that and think about it enough, you realize you might know more than you think you know about the current reality, or you might need to rethink some assumptions that you have. So the current state is really the ground you're standing on now. And then future, the vision, asks the question or answers the question, where are we going? What's our destination that we have in mind? And strategy, if you think about the need for strategy, that lives in the middle of the present and the future. So that arrow between present and future is where strategy resides. And so in the absence of having a strategy that you could rely on, connecting with your vision, connecting with the picture of the future allows you to create a bridge that you can start to work towards. And as that quote said, guide your current actions. I want to use another example. This is another picture of, and this is actually Nebo's vision. So I wanted to show you something and make just a couple of points about this. So back before we really knew what the implications of COVID-19 were, Nebo undertook our vision for 2025. And so a couple of the things that I want to point out. One is, if you look at the very top of this vision, that's our mission. It's in the sun. The values that we talked about are on the left-hand side. And then across the vision, you'll see a number of different pictures of our preferred future, which align with different areas of our organization. And so what this allows us to do, I think one point I would make is the distinction between what I call big V vision and little v vision. So often on a website, you'll see a vision statement that's maybe a two-sentence kind of aspirational statement of the future. That's what we call big V vision. Little v vision includes a very detailed and specific picture of the desired future that you can actually use when you plan. And so, for example, with this vision, if you just focus on the bottom right side, you'll see Nebo's space with a few planets and stars there. So Nebo was named after a lake. So space and the idea of place is very important in our vision. So there it talks about thriving DC and Atlanta offices with office buildings. So clearly in this current time, we've had to reevaluate what space really means to us. And so having this vision of the future allows us to look at what we were expecting and then reevaluate whether that is really relevant in the current day. The other one to look at the very bottom right is technology. And this is an interesting one because we already decided to increase our commitment to being technologically enabled, and not only to communicate and build technology platforms, but also deliver our services and work with clients. And so that's one that we can identify that we've actually greatly accelerated during this time. So just as an idea for some things that you can do with vision, the first is engage with it. So it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to undergo a visioning process that takes months. I was working with one client who's the head of communications for a large conservation-based not-for-profit. And he, in the course of a couple hours, brought a visioning process into his team to talk about current realities and what they're expecting for the future. And that allowed them to make some plans where they really wanted to make investments that would put them in a position for a year from now to come out the other side. So it doesn't have to be lengthy or elaborate, but engage your vision. The next would be what I talked about with our picture, is to examine your current reality and see what's practical today, or what might you have to put off? Or what priorities did you think were for the future that might be more relevant today? And then ask your team the question, what's possible now? That's really a core question of visioning. And then, as I said, vision is not a substitute for planning or strategy, but it allows you to ground it in the future. So use it to plan going forward. So for this time, we talked about 3 questions. So I laid out 3 questions at the beginning of this discussion. And the approaches that we talked about, which we've seen work, and I've also given you some examples of how we use them in our organization, is to leverage polarities, ground your decisions and use values as a guide, and then using vision as a bridge for the future. And I'd like to, before I think we have a minute or 2 for questions, but just leave you with this question about what's possible now. We're at Friday sometime wherever you are, and maybe spend some time over the weekend thinking about this question for yourself and your own organization. I've seen an incredible amount of creativity, compassion, and commitment as we've gone through these last couple of months. And that's given me hope for what's possible. So I think, this is a very hopeful message for me, which is around what are the things that are good that you can take, sustain, and use as reliable change in your organization. So I think we're at 12:59. I would just see if there's maybe a question or 2, you can add it to the chat box and maybe we can take one. I'd be happy to take questions offline as well. So I think I'll ask if Raven, if any have come through, but I'll also just leave you with this. You can reach out to us for additional resources, our newsletter, values and vision, and managing the complexity of things we work on with our clients. So we'd be happy to hear from you and engage with you on those as well. And also all the recordings will be either are already posted on our website, and this one will be added to it.
Perfect, Steve. Yes, we do have a question. It's, how can I encourage my manager to err on the side of communicating more rather than less with staff? The uncertainty about the future is real, but staff need more direction and support. And the side note is, thanks for the great presentation.
Well, thank you for joining. The easiest answer I have to that is ask. And one hypothesis I have just in thinking about that is what we talked about earlier. Decisions are really challenging right now, and I think one of the things that challenges a lot of people is making a decision or a pronouncement when they don't feel like they have the information that they need to be clear about it. And so part of it would be have some compassion, because I think those are difficult things, but also engage in conversation around that. That question about what's true now, and understanding what information we have, and seeing if you can engage in that conversation can help you maybe encourage more communication or a different type of communication around that. All right, well, we are at 1 o'clock. I would just thank you all for joining. We've really enjoyed hosting this series of webinars. We've enjoyed all the engagement we've gotten from clients in our network, potential clients. So please stay in touch with us, reach out, and we would love to support you. Have a great afternoon.